Welcome to the When Silence Breaks channel. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what country or city you're watching from. Today's story is one of those that will leave your soul in silence. It's titled The Widow and the Silence, and it takes us into the life of Marta, a 68-year-old woman who, after the death of her husband, discovers that the real danger doesn't always come from strangers, but from those we claim to love. A realistic story, full of emotional suspense, where intelligence, calm, and serenity become weapons of survival. Stay until the end, because what Marta does to regain her dignity will leave you speechless. Let's begin. Marta was 68 years old and possessed a serenity that had become her shield since the death of Antonio, her husband. She lived in the same house in Campinas where he had installed, with the patience of an engineer, every screw, every shelf, and every lamp. There, amid the smell of old books and the pots of jasmine that she tended with the discipline of someone cherishing a memory, the days passed slowly, evenly, but peacefully. Her son, Ricardo, a doctor with a noble but distracted heart, was her pride and emotional refuge. When he announced he would marry Patricia, Marta felt a spark of youth ignite her chest. She imagined that she would finally hear laughter in the house again, footsteps different from her own, and that the echo of the silence Antonio had left behind would begin to dissipate. Everything seemed like a new spring, until that initial sweetness began to fade. At first, Patricia was kind and attentive. She praised her dishes, accompanied her to the market, and listened to stories about Antonio with a calculated smile. But soon, the courteous gestures turned into orders, disguised as suggestions. One afternoon, Doña Lourdes, a woman with a stony face and eyes that measured every corner as if appraising a property, arrived with her mother. "She'll only stay a few days," Patricia said, although Marta knew from the first minute that promise had no timeline. The furniture began to move around, the frames with family photos disappeared, the colors of the curtains were replaced with cold tones. It was as if someone were slowly erasing the traces of her life to paint over it a foreign version. Ricardo, blinded by love, justified everything with a phrase that hurt Marta more than a blow. "Mom, don't exaggerate. Patricia just wants to help you." But deep down, she already knew that behind that apparent help lay a darker intention, one that would soon reveal itself. As the months passed, the home became a minefield. Marta, who had always been organized and meticulous, began to notice small changes that no one else seemed to notice. Bank letters arrived open. The keys to Antonio's desk were moved. The household documents appeared out of order. When she tried to comment on it, Patricia smiled condescendingly and told her she was confusing things, that at her age it was normal to mix up papers. Doña Lourdes reinforced the idea, speaking to Ricardo in a plaintive tone. "Poor Marta, loneliness ages the mind." These kinds of comments, repeated day after day, began to construct a parallel narrative, one in which she was the fragile one, the absent-minded one, the one who needed to be cared for. And Marta, albeit silently, began to understand that what they were trying to protect was not her well-being, but her inheritance. The day she saw the first empty drawer, the one in the desk where she kept the house deeds, something inside her changed. She didn't cry or complain. She closed her bedroom door, sat on the edge of her bed, and opened a new notebook, one with a green cover. There, she began to write down everything that happened, every word, every gesture, every shadow that crossed the house. She decided to feign docility, because she had learned in her life as a librarian that the most powerful books are those that seem harmless at first glance. If Patricia and her mother wanted to play with her mind, she would turn her apparent confusion into a strategy. From that day on, Marta stopped being the victim they imagined. She became a patient observer, a woman willing to regain, with intelligence and silence, control over her own story. One Sunday afternoon, as the sun fell behind the garden wall, Patricia entered the living room with a cup of tea and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Marta, from her armchair, pretended to be reading, but watched her out of the corner of her eye. The young woman placed her cup on the table and approached the piece of furniture that had once held Antonio's photos, now replaced by cold ceramic ornaments. "We should redecorate this area as well," she said softly. "It all looks very old." Marta only nodded, because she had learned that to respond was to fuel the argument. Her silence was her way of resisting, of marking her territory without arousing suspicion. That night, however, she heard something that made her shudder. Patricia and Doña Lourdes were talking in the kitchen, whispering about changing the name on the property deed. Marta didn't need to hear more. She understood that this wasn't about coexistence, but about conquest. The next day, pretending to be out for a walk, Marta went to the bank, where she still had a joint account with her late husband. She asked to review recent transactions, and her suspicions were confirmed. Someone had tried to access it without authorization. She returned home with her heart racing, but her mind clearer than ever. From that moment on, every word Patricia said, every look Doña Lourdes gave her, seemed like pieces of the same plan. At lunchtime, when they talked about her weak memory, Marta smiled and offered them cake, as if it were nothing. Inside, she was calculating what documents she should safeguard, what evidence to gather, what behavior to adopt to make them underestimate her even more. Sometimes, in the silence of the afternoon, she remembered a phrase Antonio used to say to him: "Wolves always get too comfortable when they think the shepherd is asleep." And she, although tired, was more awake than ever. Weeks passed, and tension became part of the air. Patricia had even begun to control the food. She offered to cook, insisted on handling the shopping, and made sure Marta didn't have to worry about anything. That phrase sounded kind, but in reality it was a way of stripping her of control over her own routine. Doña Lourdes, meanwhile, spent her afternoons in front of the television, commenting on how age blurs the boundaries between reality and imagination. Marta listened without interrupting, jotting down every word in her notebook. At night, she went through drawers, photographed documents, and kept copies in an envelope hidden inside a thick-bound book in the library, one of those no one would ever open. She called it My Silent Witness. Her life had become a constant act of surreptitious observation. One night, while closing the hallway windows, Marta noticed a strange smell coming from the kitchen. She approached slowly and found Patricia pouring a white powder into a jar of cocoa. The young woman was startled to see her and stammered a clumsy excuse. "I'm just switching the sugar for sweetener, for your health." Marta smiled and nodded, but deep inside, she felt an icy current run through her body. That same night she wrote 3 full pages in her notebook, describing in detail the scene, the time, Patricia's trembling gesture as she closed the jar. Then she hid the notebook in a metal box under the closet floor. She knew something terrible was afoot, and that silence was her best weapon until she had enough proof. In the darkness of her room, as she listened to the muffled laughter of mother and daughter in the living room, she realized that her survival would depend on her ability to pretend she hadn't understood anything. The next morning, the atmosphere was so charged that even the birdsong sounded distant. Patricia prepared breakfast with exaggerated kindness, serving coffee and toast as if everything were in order. But Marta noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she placed the tray on the table. Ricardo, oblivious to the tension, talked about his shifts at the hospital. smiling, unaware of the coldness between the three women. Doña Lourdes, on the other hand, watched silently, with the look of someone who has already made up her mind. It was then that Marta understood she couldn't wait for the truth to reveal itself. If she wanted to survive, she would have to produce her own evidence, something no one could deny. She waited until everyone had left to search the pantry and found, behind a can of cocoa, a small box with the name of a controlled-use sedative. She didn't hesitate. She photographed it, put it away again, and wrote down the date. The house, once a refuge, was now a chessboard where every move had to be calculated down to the last millimeter. That same afternoon, when Patricia returned from the supermarket, she found Marta in the kitchen preparing an apple pie. "What a surprise," she said, with a rehearsed smile. Marta, without taking her eyes off the dough, responded sweetly, "Sometimes books teach you more than people. You just have to know how to read between the lines." Patricia didn't understand the message, or chose to ignore it. As the smell of baking filled the air, Doña Lourdes approached with her usual tea and mentioned something about changing Ricardo's health insurance. It was a small detail, but enough to confirm that everything revolved around her son. They wanted to make him believe his mother was losing her mind. That night, when he returned, Patricia feigned concern. She told him that Marta had forgotten to turn on the gas, that she was confusing names, that she wasn't sleeping well. Ricardo looked at her sympathetically and promised to talk to her. In reality, Marta had already expected it. She knew that, to break the manipulation, she had to let them believe they were victorious a little longer. When Ricardo entered her room that night, he found her sitting by the window, reading a book with worn covers. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked in a soft voice, like someone afraid of breaking something fragile. Marta looked up, smiled, and calmly closed the book. He explained that Patricia was worried, that she had noticed changes, distractions, forgetfulness. Marta listened to him silently without defending herself. Each word was like a dagger wrapped in velvet. In the end, she simply replied, "Maybe the house is too full of voices, son. When there's so much noise, anyone can get confused." Ricardo sighed, kissed her forehead and left, not understanding that his mother had just given him the key to everything. As soon as he left, Marta wrote in her notebook, "They're starting to prepare the ground. They're drawing me like a shadow, but I still know who I am." The following days moved like dominoes, falling one after the other in a seemingly inevitable sequence. Patricia increased her control, accompanying Marta to the doctor, checking her medications, intervening in every call. Doña Lourdes reinforced her rhetoric with her tone of false tenderness. "Don't worry, Marta, we'll take care of everything." In public, they were the picture of affection. In private, their eyes shone with impatience, as if they were waiting for the old woman to sign the documents they so desperately wanted. But Marta was in no hurry. She watched, listened, and took notes. She knew that the enemy's power lay in time, and that if she managed to hold out a little longer, the plan would collapse under its own weight. Meanwhile, she prepared her counterattack with the patience of someone who knows that the truth isn't shouted, it's revealed. One Friday morning, Patricia appeared with a radiant smile and a tray in her hands. "I made you something special today, Marta," she said, placing a cup of thick, fragrant hot chocolate in front of her. Steam rose in gentle spirals, but the aroma had a metallic note that made Marta's skin crawl. She feigned gratitude, held the cup close to her face as if to taste it, but her eyes remained fixed on Patricia's. "What a sweet touch," she murmured, and without anyone noticing, she exchanged her cup with the one on the counter, the white one Patricia had left for herself. Doña Lourdes, sitting in the corner, watched the scene with the tense calm of someone waiting for a result. Marta, on the other hand, seemed calm, even grateful. Deep down, she knew that gesture would decide the course of everything. Minutes later, the stroke of fate became audible, a loud noise, a stifled gasp. Doña Lourdes had taken the wrong cup. She fell onto the table, her face pale, her eyes wide, her hands clenched on the tablecloth. Patricia called out her name and ran to her, while Marta slowly got up and picked up the phone. "Emergency, please," she said in a firm voice. "I think someone has been poisoned in my house." When the paramedics arrived, Patricia was trembling, unable to explain what had happened. Marta, calm, simply commented that she had smelled something strange in the chocolate and, as a precaution, had preferred not to drink it. That phrase, spoken without drama, was enough to change everything. And if you're listening to this story so far, tell me from what part of the world you're watching. Sometimes sharing these stories reminds us that calm can also save us. The minutes that followed were a choreography of chaos. The paramedics attended to Doña Lourdes, who was barely breathing, while Patricia tried to explain the inexplicable. Her speech changed with each question. First, she said the hot chocolate was for her, then that Marta had taken it by mistake, then that perhaps the cocoa powder was expired. Marta, with the serenity of someone who has spent years sorting truths and lies, as if they were books, simply observed. On the floor, the tablecloth was still stained with the spilled drink, and to one side, a small plastic bag gleamed in the lamplight. One of the paramedics picked it up, looked at the name printed on the label and frowned. Marta didn't need to read it. She already knew what it said, the same sedative she had photographed weeks before. That coincidence sealed her certainty. The truth was beginning to reveal itself. Like invisible ink before a flame. When the ambulance left, the house hung in a tense silence. Patricia collapsed in a chair, crying without tears, while Ricardo, who had been called in urgently, arrived, his face contorted. "What happened here?" he asked, looking at his mother and then at his wife. Marta spoke slowly, without accusation, recounting exactly what had happened, every detail, without mincing words. Ricardo listened silently, his expression oscillating between horror and disbelief. Patricia tried to interrupt, but he raised his hand to silence her. In that moment, for the first time, Marta saw in her son's eyes a flicker of doubt toward the woman he had defended so deeply. And that flicker, small but real, was the first crack in the wall of manipulation that had held her prisoner for months. That night, no one slept. The police arrived shortly after, took statements, and removed the blue cup as evidence. Marta watched everything with a strange calm, as if she were witnessing a strange scene. Deep down, she didn't feel triumph, but a profound sadness. The kind you feel when betrayal comes from someone to whom you had opened the door of your home. Ricardo hugged her silently, unable to utter a word, while the officers searched the kitchen and took away a bag of suspicious powder. Patricia tried to maintain her story, repeating that it had all been an accident, but the trembling in her voice betrayed her. Marta, for her part, understood that she no longer needed to defend herself. The facts spoke for themselves. It was as if the house, witness to everything, finally breathed after months of oppression. At dawn, Ricardo accompanied the police officers to the hospital. Marta was left alone, looking out the window at the garden. The jasmine she had planted with Antonio was still blooming, oblivious to the human tragedies. She made coffee, poured it into the old white cup, and sat in silence. In her mind, every recent memory aligned like pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. There were no tears or anger, only one certainty. She had won the most dangerous battle of her life without raising her voice. Outside, the sun rose slowly over the rooftops of Campinas, tinting the sky a tranquil orange. Marta looked up and whispered, "Antonio, I think I can rest now." But rest would not come yet. What followed was justice. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what Marta already suspected. Doña Lourdes had ingested a high dose of a sedative that could be fatal in a matter of minutes. Patricia, faced with the officer's questions, oscillated between tears and denial. Ricardo, overwhelmed, just stared at the floor, as if the entire weight of the world had fallen on him. When Marta arrived, her notebook in hand, the atmosphere froze. She slowly approached her son and handed him her phone, showing him a photo of the pharmacy receipt for the medication. "I found it in your purse, Ricardo. I kept it because I knew this moment would come." Marta's voice didn't tremble. Her tone was that of a woman who no longer needed to be believed, but respected. Ricardo looked up, and for the first time he saw her not as his elderly mother, but as a woman who had survived a silent war. The following days were a parade of statements, lawyers, and police visits. Patricia tried to blame the pharmacist, claiming it was all a mistake, but the evidence was too clear. The case became local news, and neighbors began to look at Marta with a mixture of respect and amazement. Some approached the gate with flowers or words of support, and she always responded with the same serenity. "Thank you, but the important thing is that the truth came to light." At home, she put everything back in its place. Antonio's portraits, the books on the shelf, the blue cup on the mantelpiece. It was like rebuilding an intimate altar, a space that had been desecrated and now regained its soul. Even so, every corner held the echo of betrayal, a reminder that evil can enter silently, disguised as family. When Ricardo returned from the hospital, his gaze lost in thought, Marta offered him tea, but he didn't accept. "I don't understand how I didn't see it, Mum," he murmured, collapsing into a chair. Marta stroked his hand tenderly. "Because you wanted to see the best in them, son. Sometimes love is a stronger bandage than any lie." Ricardo wept inconsolably, repeating that he felt guilty, that he had doubted her. Marta didn't interrupt him. She let him empty himself, like someone letting water run to cleanse a well. She knew forgiveness wouldn't come quickly, but at least now the truth was out in the open. When the crying stopped, Ricardo looked at her with a mixture of pain and relief. "I promise you that none of this will go unpunished," he said, his voice firm. Marta nodded, knowing that human justice was slow but inevitable. The days that followed were strange. Without Patricia or her mother, the house sounded different again. The ticking of the clock, the footsteps in the hallway, the wind rustling the curtains. But silence was no longer an enemy, it was companionship. Marta returned to her routines, watering the plants, reading in the evening, making her own coffee. Each daily gesture was an act of regained independence. Sometimes she found herself recalling the details of the past few months, wondering at what exact moment she had stopped being a victim and had become a strategist. And although her body showed signs of accumulated fatigue, her mind shone with a new lucidity. It was the lucidity of someone who has crossed fire and emerged without being completely burned, with enough scars to remember, but also with the calm of knowing she survived. The judicial process moved slowly, like everything involving bureaucracy and power. Patricia was formally accused of attempted murder and document forgery. Her mother, still convalescing, became an involuntary witness to her own crime. Marta attended each hearing with the same composure with which she had faced life, without raising her voice, without seeking revenge. She just wanted to close the cycle. Around her, journalists searched for headlines. Curious onlookers whispered versions of the story. But all she could think about was returning to her garden, When the judge ordered Patricia to be held in pre-trial detention, Marta breathed a sigh of relief, not because of the sentence, but because she could finally sleep without fear. That night, as she turned off the lamp in her room, she felt the pure sound of silence for the first time in a long time. It was different. It didn't weigh down, it didn't suffocate. It sounded like freedom. In the following days, Ricardo began visiting her every afternoon. He brought fruit, fresh bread, and a clumsy attempt to repair the emotional damage the deception had caused. Marta held no grudges, but she didn't pretend anything had happened either. A new sincerity developed between them, less idealized, more human. They spoke little, but only the essentials. One afternoon, while sharing a cup of coffee, Ricardo asked her, "How did you know something wasn't right?" She smiled, looking out the window. "Because when someone changes the soul of a house, the air becomes different, and I learned to listen to the air." As the weeks passed, life began to regain its rhythm, although nothing was the same. Marta rediscovered the value of silence. What had once suffocated her now served as a refuge. She spent her mornings in the garden, reading or watering the plants, while the sun filtered through the leaves like a caress. Every corner of the house had a story, and she had become its guardian. She no longer closed doors in fear or looked over her shoulder. She knew the shadows could return, but also that they would no longer find her defenseless. In the village, people greeted her with respect, some with a knowing smile, others with silent admiration. Marta, however, wasn't looking for recognition. Hers wasn't heroism, it was survival. One afternoon, Ricardo arrived with a box wrapped in white paper. Inside was a new blue cup, identical to the one the police had brought as evidence. "So you can drink your coffee without fear, Mom," he said with a sad smile. Marta held it in her hands and felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't the object that mattered, but the gesture. She placed it next to Antonio's old clock, on the shelf that once again belonged solely to her. In that moment, she understood that it wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about living with it without losing her calm. Over time, Marta began receiving letters from women who had read her story in the local newspaper. Some told her about their own silences. Others simply congratulated her for her courage. She responded to each one with the same phrase, "I'm not brave. I just learned to listen when everyone tried to silence me." Her words spread like seeds, and without her even seeking it, she became a kind of reference for other older women who also suffered psychological abuse or manipulation in their homes. They weren't movie heroines. They were real women who cooked, watered plants, and hid tears behind curtains. Marta reminded them that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and that whisper is enough to survive. One winter morning, she received a visit from a young journalist who wanted to write a story about the widow who defeated silence. Marta greeted her with tea and a smile. "I didn't overthrow silence," she said. "I made it my ally." The journalist looked at her in surprise, not fully understanding. Silence is dangerous when others impose it, but when you choose it, it becomes strength. During the interview, Marta spoke little, but her every word carried the weight of a painfully won truth. When it was over, the young woman left with tears in her eyes, and as Marta closed the door, she felt that her story no longer belonged to her alone. She was one of those who had ever been called crazy, exaggerated, or confused for daring to see what others pretended not to. That night, as she arranged her books on the shelf, Marta found the green notebook where she had written everything, every suspicion, every word, every gesture. She hesitated whether to keep it or destroy it. But as she opened the first page, she read her own trembling handwriting. "They are erasing me, but I still exist." She stared at that sentence for a long time. It was the voice of the woman she had once been, and also proof of the woman she had later become. She carefully closed the notebook and placed it in a wooden box next to a photo of Antonio, not as evidence but as a memoir of resistance. Silently, she was grateful for having had the courage to wait for the right moment to act. It wasn't revenge, it was dignity. The following months passed with small routines that gave her life meaning again. She made jams, read old novels, and met on Saturdays with a group of neighbors at the neighborhood library. There they talked about books, memories, and how time transforms fear into wisdom. Marta tended to listen more than she spoke, but when someone asked her for advice, she responded with the calmness of someone who no longer had anything to prove. Trust your intuition, because when something doesn't fit, the soul always knows it before the mind. That phrase became her most sincere legacy, repeated by many as a reminder that even the quietest battles can be won without shouting. One day, Ricardo suggested that she move with him to the city so he could be closer and take better care of her. Marta appreciated the gesture, but declined with a calm smile. "This house saw me born as a wife, suffer as a mother, and be reborn as a woman. If I leave, it would be like erasing my history again." Ricardo understood and didn't insist. Instead, he promised to visit her every weekend. He kept his word. Every Saturday, he arrived with bread, fresh, flowers, and the patience of someone who seeks to make amends without saying so. A new, more honest relationship developed between them, free from the shadows that had once loomed. Marta, for her part, no longer needed explanations. She had learned that forgiveness isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's simply breathed. At the beginning of autumn, Marta decided to reorganize Antonio's desk. While cleaning out the drawers, she found a sealed envelope with his handwriting on it. Inside, a short letter that said, "If one day silence weighs on you, remember that it was written to protect you." Marta smiled, tears still lingering. She didn't know if Antonio had written it in life or if it was one of those forgotten pieces of paper that acquire meaning over time, but she felt it was a response. She placed it under the glass of the desk so she could see it every morning. From then on, every day began the same: a coffee in her blue cup, a walk in the garden, and the certainty that, even after everything, life still had room for peace. With the arrival of winter, the cold seemed to seep through the cracks in her memory. Marta, however, welcomed him like an old friend. She lit the fireplace, wrapped herself in her wool shawl, and lost herself among the pages of books that spoke of bygone days. Sometimes she thought about Patricia, wondering if she had understood the magnitude of her actions. She didn't wish her ill. She only hoped that somehow remorse would force her to look at her own undisguised reflection. Doña Lourdes, for her part, was still alive, but her health had deteriorated. Ricardo told her that he rarely spoke, that he avoided mentioning Marta's name. She listened in silence, without joy or resentment, because she had understood that some defeats aren't celebrated, they are simply accepted. One grey afternoon, the postman knocked on the door with an official envelope. It was a court notification. The case had come to an end. Patricia had been sentenced to prison, and the attempt to alter the house's deeds was annulled. Marta read the document calmly, took a deep breath, and put it in the desk drawer next to Antonio's letter. She closed the drawer with a firm click, the sound of a cycle that was sealed forever. Then she made herself a hot chocolate, this time real, aromatic, without fear, and drank it in front of the window, watching the wind move the jasmine branches. She didn't think of justice or revenge, but of balance. The universe, somehow, had managed to give her back what belonged to her, her peace. As the days passed, news of the verdict spread through the neighborhood. Some saw her as a quiet heroine, others as a miraculously lucky woman. Marta, on the other hand, felt neither. "I was just patient," she would say. But at night, when the clock struck 10 and the house fell silent, she remembered every moment of that afternoon with hot chocolate, the trembling of the cup, Patricia's cold gaze, and she understood that she had won. Much more than a trial, she had regained the right to believe in herself. That thought, repeated softly, accompanied her as she closed her eyes. She slept peacefully without nightmares, certain that it wasn't her age that saved her, but her lucidity. As the months turned into years, Marta's story began to spread by word of mouth. At the library, young volunteers asked her to tell how she knew everything from the beginning. She smiled and always responded the same way, because evil never fully imitates tenderness. It always leaves a different shadow. That phrase remained etched in the memories of many. And although Marta didn't seek to be remembered, her name began to be mentioned at community meetings and talks on emotional defense. Some called her the Jasmine Woman because of her habit of giving small white flowers to those who asked her for advice. It was her way of saying that fragility can also smell of strength. One spring morning, Marta was invited to give a short talk at a cultural center for senior citizens. She hesitated at first, but accepted. She put on her blue dress, the same one she had worn on her 30th anniversary with Antonio, and walked slowly but firmly to the auditorium. In front of her, a dozen attentive faces looked at her with curiosity and respect. She didn't talk about poisonings or trials. She spoke of silence, of how sometimes peace is an act of defense, not surrender. "They tried to take away my voice," she said, "but I discovered that you didn't have to shout to be heard. You just had to speak the truth calmly." When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. Some were crying. Marta felt a deep warmth in her chest, as if a part of Antonio still accompanied her. Proud. After the talk, a woman approached her. She was about 50 years old, with a tired face and moist eyes. She took her hands and said softly, "I also have a Patricia in my house." Marta looked at her tenderly and replied, "Then you are not alone. Listen to the air. It always warns you when something isn't right." The woman hugged her, and in that instant, Marta understood that her story was no longer her own. It had become a silent beacon for others. That night, when she got home, she placed a jasmine flower on her desk and wrote on a fresh sheet of paper, "Shared pain becomes learning." Then she turned off the lamp and let the silence, her old ally, envelop her once again. In the following months, Marta's garden flourished like never before. Neighbors said her house smelled different, more alive, as if the earth had breathed after years of sleep. Marta spent every morning tending the plants, talking to them in a low voice. "We survived, right?" she would say, and the leaves seemed to respond with a slight movement. Sometimes she received visits from women who came to ask her advice, or simply to listen. She served tea and listened without interruption, letting each one find her own words. There were no long speeches or advice, just glances, silences, and the certainty that every wound, if cared for patiently, eventually blossoms. One day, while checking her mail, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside, a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for inspiring me not to be afraid." It didn't say who sent it, but Marta didn't need to know. She kept it in the same green notebook, the one that had once been her refuge, and was now a testament to hope. That night, as the wind blew gently through, The jasmine bushes. She sat by the window with her blue cup. She thought about how far she had come without leaving home, about the battles that can't be seen, but change the course of a life. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, smiled without a trace of sadness. The following autumn brought rainy days and grey skies, but Marta no longer feared loneliness. She had learned to live with it, to understand it as an old companion who, though silent, never betrayed her. On rainy afternoons, she wrote short reflections that she later stored between the pages of her books. Some were about Antonio, others about freedom, and many about the strength that comes from silence. Ricardo visited her every Sunday, and sometimes they spent hours talking in front of the fireplace. They had learned to listen to each other without guilt, like two souls who recognize each other after having lost each other. In those moments, Marta understood that the love of a child, when cleansed of lies, can heal even the deepest wounds. One Sunday, as Ricardo was saying goodbye, he handed her a folded envelope. "It's a copy of the file, Mom. The case is officially closed." Marta took it delicately, placed it in a drawer, and said, "Then rest it too." She didn't speak of the subject again. That night, the sound of rain against the tiles brought her peace. She poured herself some tea and sat by the window. In the reflection of the glass, she thought she saw Antonio smiling for a moment, and it seemed to her that time was finally giving her back a fragment of the life that had been stolen from her. It was the symbolic closure of a story that had begun in fear, but was now told with serenity. When spring arrived, Marta's house was filled with light again. The jasmines bloomed early, and the sweet aroma permeated every corner. That morning, as she made coffee, she decided to open all the windows. The fresh air rushed in, stirring the curtains as if the past were finally saying, "Goodbye." On the shelf, the blue mug shone in the sun. Marta took it in her hands and remembered that day when the same mug had once been a symbol of danger. Now it was an emblem of victory. "Nothing is what it seems," she murmured, smiling. Outside, the children played, the neighbors chatted, and for the first time in a long time, normality no longer seemed alien. Her home, at last, belonged to her again. That afternoon, Ricardo took her to a nearby park. They walked slowly, talking about simple things, recipes, books, the weather. Marta watched him and thought about how much he had changed too. He had matured, learned to see beyond appearances. They stopped by a bench and Ricardo said, "You know, Mum, I don't think I ever told you this, but you are the strongest person I know." She smiled and responded tenderly, "Strength isn't in fighting, son, but in resisting without losing yourself." In that instant, they understood that the pain they had experienced had united them in a deeper way than any perfect love. They didn't need to speak anymore. The shared silence was enough to understand everything. As the years passed, Marta remained the same quiet woman, although her name had become almost a legend among those who knew her story. Not because she sought fame, but because her serenity had left its mark. In the neighborhood library, a small plaque bore the words, "To Marta Silva, for teaching us that silence also speaks." Every time someone pointed at her with admiration, she would shrug and say, "I only learned to listen to what others ignore." That humility made her even more respected. In her garden, jasmine grew vigorously, and the scent drifted in through the open windows, mingling with the sound of the leaves and the bird song. It was as if nature, a silent accomplice, celebrated her resilience. One afternoon, while watching the sunset, Marta wrote her last entry in her green notebook. "There is no victory without wounds, but neither are there wounds that time cannot heal if there is calm in the heart. She closed the notebook and put it in a box next to her blue mug. Then she looked at the camera on her old cell phone, recording a brief message for her reading group. Don't be silent when something hurts you, but don't waste your voice on someone who doesn't want to listen. And if this story touched your soul, share it with someone who needs a sign of strength. You never know who it might restore hope to. After that message, Marta sighed with relief, as if she were leaving a part of herself to the world for when she could no longer share it in person. That night, as the sky turned violet, Marta lit a candle on the desk and stared into the flame. The flickering light illuminated Antonio's face in the old photograph, and for the first time in many years, she felt everything was in its place. There was no resentment, no sorrow, no fear, only gratitude, for having resisted, for having had the clarity to act silently, for having regained her dignity without destroying herself in the attempt. Outside, the wind stirred the jasmine branches, and the scent filled the room like a blessing. Marta closed her eyes and thought that perhaps this was true justice, being able to breathe in peace after so much noise. The next day she got up early and wrote a short letter to Ricardo. In it, she thanked him for believing in her in the end, for becoming her son again without excuses or explanations. She asked him, when she was gone, to keep the garden alive and give a jasmine plant every spring to someone in need. The scent of these flowers, she wrote, always reminded me that small things can be stronger than terrible things. Then she put the letter in the desk drawer, next to the green notebook. She made her coffee, poured it into the blue cup, and stepped out onto the porch to welcome the morning sun. The world, at last, was calm. The years passed, discreetly and peacefully, just as she had hoped. Marta aged, without drama, surrounded by books, flowers, and occasional visits from Ricardo, who never broke his Saturday promise. Every corner of the house retained something of her. The scent of jasmine, the blue cup on the shelf, the chair by the window where she used to read. She needed nothing more. She had understood that happiness isn't always euphoria. Sometimes it's just the peace of knowing no one else has power over you. When her body began to crave rest, Marta didn't fear it. She allowed herself to be cared for without losing her character or her smile. Serenity was now her second language. Years later, when Marta quietly passed away, the house was left exactly as she had left it, tidy, warm, and alive. Ricardo fulfilled her wish to give a jasmine plant every spring. Neighbors, passing by, said the scent remained the same, as if Marta had never truly left. In the library, her story remained stored in a glass case, next to her green notebook and the phrase that best defined her. Calmness is not weakness, it's strategy. And so, without noise or pretense, the woman who was once underestimated ended up transformed into a symbol of strength.